My mother watched me walk away with 2 babies and a broken heart, never imagining the day she'd beg for a seat at a table I built alone. The year I turned 26, my husband was buried under a cold Texas sky. 3 weeks later, I stood on my mother's doorstep with a sleeping toddler in each arm and less than $400 to my name. She opened the door wearing her good cardigan, and she didn't invite me in. I begged for 3 weeks. Just a corner, just enough time to breathe. She crossed her arms and said something I would replay in my head for almost a decade. She said I was an adult, that adults handle their own problems. Then she looked past me at the car where my babies were sleeping and told me the family couldn't afford to be my safety net. The porch light clicked off before I made it back to the driveway. I drove to the county line before I let myself cry. Then I pulled over at a gas station and called the only other number I could remember. Ruth Sinclair picked up on the second ring. I told her I was sorry, that I didn't know who else to call. She didn't ask questions. She just listened. Then she asked where I was. 40 minutes later, Walt Sinclair's truck rolled into that gas station lot. He got out without a word and started transferring car seats like he'd done it 100 times before. Ruth came around the passenger side carrying a quilt she'd stitched with her own hands when the twins were born. She wrapped Caleb in it first, then Hannah. Then she pressed a warm dish into my hands, still hot from her stove, and told me to follow them home. That was the night I learned that blood means nothing. It was the night I found my real family, and I didn't even know it yet. Family isn't who shares your blood, it's who shows up. The Sinclair property was 80 acres of broken fences and hope. They lived in a ranch house with a porch that sagged in the middle. But Ruth cleared out Daniel's old room for the twins and put me across the hall. They never asked what I could give them. They just set 2 more plates and made space. I spent the first week staring at the ceiling and listening to horses shift in the dark. I had a degree in equine science that I'd paid for with night shifts and double shifts, but I'd never had a chance to really use it. Walt walked me out to see his stock on the 9th day. That's when I saw her. A bay mare with a left front leg that turned in at the knee. Walt said he was sending her to the auction because nobody wanted a crooked horse, but I stood at that stall and watched her move. Something about the way she planted her weight, the way she rolled through that bad joint. I asked Walt to give me till spring. He looked at me like I'd lost his mind. Then, he looked at the mare. Then, he nodded. The mare's name was Juniper. She became my project, my obsession, and eventually my salvation. I worked every job I could find. I broke colts at sunrise, drove feed routes at noon, and read genetics papers long after the kids went to sleep. Walt offered me a wage, and I refused it for 4 months because I didn't want to owe anyone anything. I'd learned that love comes with a bill attached, and I didn't have the credit. One night, Walt found me asleep, standing up in the wash rack with a hose still running. He turned off the water and told me nobody was keeping score. I didn't believe him. I spent my whole life believing love had to be earned, and you couldn't unlearn that in a single season. But I kept working. I kept building, and I kept telling myself the twins were lucky to have a mother who never quit. It took 14 months to train Juniper. I didn't fight her leg, I worked around it. I conditioned her to use what she had instead of apologizing for it. By spring, she could stop faster and turn harder than horses, worth 10 times her price. I entered her in a small futurity 2 counties over. I wasn't expecting anything. I just needed validation. She ran her pattern early that morning, and her bad leg let her sink into the ground like she was pouring herself into the earth. We placed third out of 41. I stood in the dirt holding a green ribbon worth maybe nothing, and I felt something solid under my feet for the first time in over a year. But that wasn't the part that changed everything. An older woman in the second row had been watching me the whole time. She approached me after the event and asked where Juniper came from. I told her I'd built her from a horse headed for slaughter. She studied me for a long moment, then handed me a business card and said she'd be in touch. The card said Vivian Hargrove. I had no idea who she was. I was about to find out. Vivian Hargrove was a legend in the performance horse world. She'd bred champions for 40 years. She'd built a portfolio that opened gates from Texas to Kentucky. And she showed up at the Sinclair place that February in a truck worth more than the entire farm. She asked to see Juniper move. She watched for 10 minutes without speaking. Then she turned to me and asked what else I could see. I told her the truth. I thought Juniper's line could produce an entire generation of horses that moved like her. The trait was heritable, and the market would pay for it if I could prove it. Vivian asked how much it would cost to find out. I'd run the numbers 100 times in my head, so I gave her the figure without flinching. She didn't flinch either. She said she had no patience for watching talent stay buried under bad luck. Then she said the words I was terrified to hear. "Let me invest in you." My first instinct was no, because I'd learned what people meant when they offered help. I'd learned it on a porch in October. So I asked Vivian for the terms in writing. Every line of them. She smiled, like I'd just passed some kind of test. I hired a lawyer named Pat who charged me in installments and earned every dollar. We spent 3 weeks negotiating. Vivian would fund the breeding program and hold a minority stake, but I insisted on keeping the bloodline itself entirely under my control. The genetics, the breeding rights, the records, all of it. Vivian read my terms, looked over her glasses, and said I was going to do just fine. She signed in blue ink on a Tuesday. I signed under her. That click I heard in my chest was the sound of a foundation setting. I didn't know it then, but I had just built the wall my family would one day break against. The first Juniper foal arrived in the spring. A leggy bay colt with the same low-loading hindquarter. We named the program after the creek that ran along the back of the property. I bred carefully, 3 mares the first year, then 6. I matched Juniper's line to outside blood that complemented her trait. When that first colt was 2 years old, I had buyers calling who'd never returned my texts. He sold at auction for a number that made Walt sit down on an overturned bucket and stay there for a while. The money started slow. Then, it started fast. We fixed the barn roof. We paid the bank ahead of schedule. The foreclosure conversation that had lived in my chest like a second heartbeat simply stopped. And one Sunday that fall, I fed the ranch hands lunch out of the same chipped dish Ruth had pressed into my hands at the gas station years before. She caught me using it and smiled, then looked away. My mother called on a Thursday in March. Not Christmas, not my birthday. A regular, ordinary Thursday, which is how I knew something had changed. Her voice was different. Warmer. She asked how I was and actually waited for the answer. She asked about the ranch. She used the program's name correctly, which meant she'd heard it somewhere, which meant my story had traveled. She asked about Caleb and Hannah by name, though the names came out half a second slow, like she'd practiced them in the driveway. I stood in the tack room holding the phone and felt not warmth, but cold awareness. The same kind you get when a horse you trust suddenly pins its ears. My mother was being kind to me. After almost 8 years, I asked her how she heard about the ranch. She said people talk, that she'd seen something online about a young woman doing well with horses. She said maybe she could bring the kids by sometime. That family shouldn't be strangers. I said I'd see, and I got off the phone. The reason for her call arrived in my inbox by accident a month later. My brother Travis forwarded me an email meant for my mother. He'd caught the wrong contact. Underneath his new message sat an entire thread scrolling back 6 years. I almost deleted it. Then I saw my name. There it was. A conversation between my mother, my father, and my brother from the spring after Daniel died. My mother had written that taking me in would have been throwing good money after bad, that I'd made my choices marrying a poor rancher, that some people were a bad investment. My father had agreed, adding that they had to think about Travis's future. And then the line that hollowed me out. My mother had written, "We keep it civil. We don't burn the bridge completely, because you never know. If the ranch ever amounts to something, we'll want the door cracked." They hadn't forgotten me out of carelessness. They'd filed me away on purpose. An asset marked down. A position they'd hold in case it appreciated. The warm phone calls weren't a thaw. They were a quarterly review. I read it 3 times, standing in the kitchen, and waited for the rage. It didn't come. What came instead was clarity. I printed the email so I would never confuse what they were doing with love. I didn't plot revenge. I don't think that way. Instead, I decided I would not give them my anger. I would not call my mother and read the email back to her. I would not let Travis pull me into a fight. I would do the one thing my whole family had never expected. I would outbuild them. I would make something so solid that when they reached for it, their hands would close on air. You can't win an argument with people who keep their own books. So, you make the books airtight. The program grew. Juniper became a proven producer, the matriarch of a line that buyers across 3 states wanted. Her foals were the literal foundation of everything we'd built. By the time she was 9, we had a training facility, a client list with a waiting list, and a reputation that reached beyond the county line. I walked out to her stall that night and stood in the dark the way I had on day 9. Except now, the barn had a new roof and the bank was paid, and 2 kids were asleep in a house that was warm. I scratched Juniper under the jaw and thought about doors. The ones that close on you, the ones that open, and the ones you learn to build yourself. You'd think people who wrote off a widow in an email would have the decency to stay away. Mine did the opposite. They discovered a sudden public devotion to me. The first time I saw it, I was at a major futurity with cameras everywhere. My mother and Travis showed up uninvited, found me at the trailer, and turned into a Hallmark card the second a lens swung our way. My mother hugged me for the photographer, her hand spread on my back like she was presenting me. Travis told a reporter, loud enough to carry, that the family had always believed in me. I stood there like a fence post they were leaning on. And I understood what they were doing. They were building a story. The story of a close family who'd stood by their girl through hard times. They were laying the groundwork to stand beside me when it paid off, so nobody would ever question why they got a piece. They dealt in images. They always had. I let them have their photos. I smiled the right amount. I filed each moment away, because I'd already decided how this ended. They would build their image in public, and when the day came, I would answer it with the truth, out loud, in front of everyone they'd ever wanted to impress. There was one moment that nearly cracked me open. My father found me alone after the photographs, away from my mother. And he stood working his hat in his hands the way he did when he couldn't find a place to put himself. He said he thought about that night a lot. He said he and my mother had fought afterward, the worst fight of their marriage. He said he'd sat in the truck with the keys in his hand and should have driven to me. For one suspended second, I was 12 again, wanting so badly to believe my father would have come. Then I asked him the only question that mattered. Dad, that was 8 years ago. Where are you standing now? He looked at the ground. The silence stretched. In that silence, I got my answer. If he were standing with me, he'd have said so. Instead, he said something about it being complicated. About your mother. About not wanting to choose sides. He'd had 8 years and a confession halfway up his throat, and he still couldn't take one step out of her shadow. I didn't hate him, I just saw him clearly. A man who felt the right thing and would never once do it. If you've ever had a parent who only loved you when you were useful, you already know the sound of that voice. The offer came when Caleb and Hannah were 9. A Western lifestyle company, the kind that owns competitions and clothing lines, had been circling for a year. They sat across from me and Pat at my own kitchen table and slid a number across the wood. $100 million for the land, the facility, the brand, and the breeding rights. I sat with that number for a moment. It wasn't $100 million in a suitcase. Most of it was tied to the value of the bloodline and how the line performed after the sale. But the headline was real, and the headline was the kind of number that ends up in magazines. I asked for 2 weeks. They gave me 3. That night, I walked out to Juniper's stall. She was 12 now, retired from the show pen to a soft paddock. I leaned on the rail and knew selling meant I would never again have to ask anyone for a place to sleep or a plate of food. It meant the door was finally, permanently mine. I already knew I'd take it. The only question left was who I'd open the door for. I built the answer on paper, airtight, with Pat. 3 structures. The first was an irrevocable trust for Caleb and Hannah, locked so tightly that no charm or lawsuit could pry a dollar loose. They'd be educated, secure, and free. No one would ever stand on a porch pricing them. The second was for Walt and Ruth. The deed to the original 80 acres and the farmhouse signed back to them free and clear, plus a funded account that would carry them comfortably for the rest of their lives. Not a gift wrapped in obligation, just theirs. When I told Ruth, she put down the dish towel and said I didn't owe them a thing. I told her I knew. That was exactly why. The third was the Daniel Sinclair Memorial Scholarship Foundation, funded to help young people pursue equine science, with a specific preference in the bylaws for applicants raising children alone. I wrote that line myself. I made Pat read it back twice. Everything I did was documented. My family dealt in feelings and photographs and elastic memory. I dealt in signatures, witnessed and notarized and filed. By the time the sale was a month from closing, I'd allocated every meaningful dollar to the people who'd shown up. I just hadn't told the people who hadn't. The news leaked the way big money always leaks. A regional business page ran it first, then the horse press, then a national outlet. The angle was irresistible. The young widow who built an empire from a crooked-legged horse. My phone came back to life like a possessed thing. My mother texted within 6 hours. So proud of you. Always knew. Travis sent messages, then more messages. The last one was just a string of celebratory graphics, like we'd won something together. My father called and left a voicemail hoping we could all sit down soon. He said he loved me. I stood in the kitchen reading it all and heard my mother's voice from 8 years ago. We can't be your safety net, except now they could see the size of the net I'd built, and every one of them was reaching for it. I didn't reply to any of it, not out of cruelty, but because silence is its own answer. I had 3 weeks until the closing and a celebration I'd planned. A real event on the ranch. The horse community. The buyer's people. Neighbors who'd watched me build this place. I had not invited my family. It hadn't occurred to me that I'd need to make that explicit. I was about to learn that for some people, an invitation is optional. Travis stopped asking and started telling. The call wasn't soft. The charm was gone. He said the family deserved to be part of this. He said deserved in a way that told me everything. He listed sacrifices I apparently remembered wrong. Then he said the thing that told me exactly how this would go. He said, "Obviously, we'll all be there for the announcement. We should talk about what's fair." There was no question mark. He wasn't asking. He was informing me they were coming and that a number would be discussed. They'd spent a year building the story of a loving family. Now they meant to collect. On my land. In front of my people. Where saying no would make me look like the villain. It was a smart play. It was the only kind of play they knew. The leverage of a scene, the cost of looking cold. I told Travis I'd see him at the event. He took it as a yes. It was not a yes. Then I called Pat and told her to make sure every document was signed, witnessed, and recorded before the date. Not after. Before, there would be nothing left to negotiate. The week before the celebration, I closed every door but one. Pat and I sat at the kitchen table until the documents were a finished thing. The trust irrevocable and funded. The deed recorded at the county office. The foundation chartered and capitalized. I read each signature line out loud one final time. By Friday, there was nothing left to give away because I'd already given it to the right people in a form that could not be reversed. And I kept one thing for myself. The only thing the buyer agreed to carve out of the deal. A single foal from Juniper's last cross. Written into the contract as mine. Retained, not for sale at any price. A bright bay filly with one white sock and a knee that turned in slightly. The kids argued over her name for an hour and finally agreed on June. I stood at the fence that evening watching Juniper and her granddaughter graze nose to nose. 11 years between them and the same beautiful leg. Everything important was locked. Everyone important was protected. All that was left was the part I'd been bracing for. They were coming. And I was ready. My mother drove out to the ranch 2 days before the event. Alone. She hadn't set foot on this land in 8 years. Now she stood in the drive, looking at the new barn, the arena, the brass nameplate by the gate. I watched her do the math behind her eyes, the same math she'd done on a porch in October. She started warm. She told me she was proud, that she'd always known I had it in me. When that didn't move me, she shifted to grief, dabbing at eyes that weren't wet. When grief didn't move me, she found the floor she was really standing on. She said, "After everything I sacrificed for you, are you really going to embarrass this family?" There it was. Not love. Leverage, I said quietly, that I had nothing to embarrass anyone with. I was just hosting a celebration for the people who'd built this place with me. She heard the shape of what I wasn't saying, and her face hardened. Behind me, the screen door opened. Ruth came out wordlessly and stood at my shoulder. She lifted the blue quilt off the porch swing and laid it around my shoulders, the same way she'd wrapped my babies at the gas station. My mother looked at that quilt for a long moment. Then she got in her car and left. The night before the celebration was clear and cool. I couldn't sleep, so I went to the barn. The grounds were ready. A tent up by the arena, chairs in rows, a small stage where I'd say a few words. I'd invited the people who mattered, Vivian, the ranch hands, neighbors who'd hauled water during the dry year, Walt and Ruth, seated front and center. I had not invited my parents or my brother. I'd thought about it and decided no. This day belonged to the people who'd shown up. There was no seat for the people who hadn't. I sat on an overturned bucket in the dark, running my words over in my head. I knew exactly what I wanted to say. I wanted to say it calmly, because the calm was the whole point. The calm was the thing they'd never been able to take from me. I'd planned every word down to the breath. What I had not planned, what I did not see coming, was that my family would simply walk through the front gate, uninvited. The day came up gold and still. By 11, the arena lot was full. Trucks and trailers and the buyers' black SUVs lined along the fence. Close to 300 people drifted across the grounds with cups of coffee and lemonade. There was a long table of food under the tent. Ruth brought her stew in that same chipped dish, scaled up to a roster, but ladled at the end out of the original. I wore a clean shirt and good boots. I shook 100 hands. Vivian squeezed my arm and said I'd done exactly what she knew I'd do. Walt and Ruth sat in the front row near the stage. Walt in a tie he hated. Ruth with the twins on either side. The buyer's lead came over to confirm we were set to make it official from the stage. Everything was calm. Everything was exactly as I'd built it. I stepped up toward the stage with my few pages of words, and I scanned the happy, sunlit crowd one last time. That's when I saw them. My mother, my father, and Travis walking in through the front gate, dressed for a photograph, working the edges of the crowd like they owned the day. Uninvited, smiling, right on time, they moved through my people like dignitaries. My mother stopped to introduce herself to strangers as Beth's mother. We always knew. Travis positioned himself near the cluster of press and leaned toward a reporter, saying loud enough to carry that the family had sacrificed everything to give me my start. My father trailed behind, hands in his pockets, eyes finding mine and then sliding away. They weren't here to celebrate. They were here to be seen celebrating. My mother caught my eye across the crowd and lifted her hand in a little wave. Proprietary, confident, the wave of a woman certain her seat was being saved. I climbed the 2 steps onto the stage. The crowd began to settle. My mother smiled out at all of them like she'd built the place herself. I set my pages on the podium. I looked at the people I loved in the front row. Then I began. I didn't raise my voice. That was the whole point. The louder a thing is, the easier it is to argue with. I started soft. The crowd leaned in to hear me. By the time I got to the part that mattered, 300 people were dead silent, straining toward every word. I thanked them for coming. I told the short version of the truth that 8 years ago I arrived in Cedar Hollow with 2 babies and nothing. The people who'd taken me in hadn't asked what I could do for them. They'd just set 2 more plates. I found Ruth's eyes in the front row. Then I said I had 2 gifts to give before we made anything official. I wanted to give them in front of everyone, because the right people deserve to be thanked out loud. First, the foundation. The banner unrolled behind me, and there it was, the Daniel Sinclair Memorial Scholarship, my late husband's name over my shoulder, funded to help young people into the work that saved my life, preference for parents raising children alone. The crowd made that warm, low sound a crowd makes when something lands. Then the second gift. I asked Walt and Ruth to stand. They did, confused, Ruth pressing her hand to her chest. I told the 300 people what I'd told no one outside a lawyer's office. The deed to this land was already signed back to Walt and Ruth Sinclair. Free and clear, theirs forever, along with everything they'd need to ever worry again. Because 8 years ago, they gave a stranger a home. You don't repay that. You can only try to match it. Ruth started to cry. Walt caught her elbow. The crowd rose to its feet. The applause rolled across the grounds like weather. And in the front rim of that crowd, 3 faces did not move. My mother's smile was still in place, but it had stopped meaning anything. It was frozen. Travis had gone white. My father stared at the stage like a man watching a train he'd assumed would stop. I let the applause settle. Then I looked right at them. Just the 3 of them. I said the only thing left to say, quietly, so the whole silent crowd could hear every word. Family isn't who shares your blood. It's who showed up. My mother found her voice first. It was not the warm one. It was the porch voice, 8 years older and twice as sharp. How dare you? She said it loud enough for everyone to hear. How dare you humiliate your family in front of all these people? There it was. The inversion I'd promised myself, the calm woman on the stage and the loud one in the crowd. The exact reverse of a porch in October. Travis tried to rescue it. He stepped forward, saying something about rights, about contributions. Words with no weight behind them because there were no documents behind them. Only a story they'd told themselves. The buyer's lead quietly signaled 2 staff who moved toward my family with the gentle, immovable politeness of people who do this for a living. My father didn't say anything. He just looked at me, and for one last second, the confession from the trailer lot flickered across his face, the thing he felt and would never do. Then he looked at the ground where he always looked and let himself be guided toward the gate. My mother kept talking the whole way out, her voice getting smaller as the distance grew. After everything I did for you. After everything. Until the gate closed, and the words stopped, and the grounds were just my people again. 300 witnesses, and a silence that finally belonged to me. The celebration went on. Because that's what celebrations do. Within 20 minutes, the strangers had folded back into music and food and ordinary joy. But I slipped away from the tent for a minute. I walked back toward the house and sat on the porch swing. Ruth came and sat beside me without a word. Somebody had left the blue star quilt folded over the arm of the swing. Soft and faded now. 8 years of washings thin in the cotton. Ruth pulled it across both our laps. Out past the rail, Juniper grazed in the gold evening light, and beside her, June mirrored her down to the crooked leg, 2 ends of a line nobody had wanted to bet on, but me. Caleb and Hannah ran across the grass toward us, breathless about something, and they piled onto the swing under the quilt. For a moment, there were 4 of us tangled up in a faded blanket that had wrapped the same babies in a parking lot once when we had nothing. We didn't have nothing anymore. But that was never really the point. You probably want to know what happened to them. My family hired a lawyer. The letter arrived a few weeks later, full of words like reasonable expectation and family contribution. Pat read it once, set it down, and said it had all the legal force of a wish. There was nothing to contest. The trust was irrevocable. The deed was recorded. The foundation was chartered. I hadn't built a scheme they could break. I'd built a structure they could only stand outside of. The letters stopped. Travis's franchise finally closed for good. The consequence of his own choices, and not $1 of mine. My father sent one more message months later. No apology, just a line that said, "Your mother won't ever forgive this." As if that were my loss. I didn't reply. Walt and Ruth still live in the farmhouse, on the 80 acres that are theirs. The funded account means Ruth finally let Walt fix his knee and take her to the coast. The first vacation of their married life. The foundation gave out its first scholarship the following fall. I want you to know who got it. A 24-year-old widow with a toddler, working nights, who wanted to learn equine science. She'd been told by everyone that it wasn't practical for a girl in her situation. I read her essay 3 times. I called Pat and told her to make sure that one went through. Because 8 years ago, a woman knocked on the wrong door with 2 babies and got told she was a bad investment. I just wanted to be the right door for somebody else. I kept a smaller place after the sale. 20 acres down the road from Walt and Ruth. A barn just big enough for what matters. I breed a handful of foals a year off June now. I do it slow and careful, and for the love of it, not because a bank is counting. Juniper still grazes by the live oak, where the kids can see her from the fence. Caleb wants to be a vet. Hannah wants to run the foundation someday. I think she will. We eat dinner at a table with no empty seats and no hidden ledgers. Most nights, it's nothing special. Just stew and homework and a dog under the table. That ordinary, unremarkable piece is the richest thing I own. It cost me $100 million to learn it was free all along. I spent the first half of my life believing I had to earn a seat at my own family's table. Until 2 people I wasn't even born to simply set one for me, asked for nothing in return, and taught me the only lesson that ever stuck. Love that keeps a ledger was never love, it was just an invoice waiting to be sent. That's my story. 1 closed door, 1 open kitchen, and a crooked-legged horse nobody wanted but me. If somebody showed up for you when your own blood wouldn't, go tell them today. Don't wait for $100 million reason. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Like this video and subscribe to Winds of Thought for more stories that remind us what truly matters. Drop a comment below and tell me about the door that opened for you. I'll see you in the next one.